Yeah.
his comments. And I can see many friends in the audience, uh, some of them with whom I have been discussing since last many years, Gandhi and his critiques. And most of them have suggested that instead of really addressing them squarely, you better abstain from that and you talk round and round, but do not go straight to those six questions. But I'm thankful to friends like Ashutosh and Dharmendra and others who have constantly to warn me for this. Yet I'm daring to venture into it. That makes me little nervous. But I'm not sure my arguments are very well worked out, particularly in front of Professor Singh and Professor Anuradha Viravali, whom I can see in the audience. I'm not sure if they will find my arguments good, but I'm attempting, I'm trying, and I think I would like to argue that if we have to engage with Gandhi, we cannot ignore those questions which are coming in the public domain. And if you conduct a survey of YouTube videos and other social media, you will discover that social media is flooded by similar videos, abusive videos about Gandhi on these six questions. And I think it is our intellectual responsibility to engage with that. Not to defend Gandhi, but to understand actually what these questions are and how did Gandhi address that question. Does that make sense to our generation or not? Or if we agree with 80% of Gandhi, then how do we look at those 20% issues which are part of Gandhian framework? So I will make a small presentation and just let me do this PowerPoint. Uh, is my PowerPoint visible?
Yes, sir. Just
All right. So this is the topic I thought I will talk at a very short notice. I have prepared this PPT, so there could be some problems. So excuse me for that. These are the four things I will do. First, I will talk about why is it so important to engage with Gandhi's critiques at this moment, and we cannot ignore them, and we should not ignore them. And no matter how much we keep going round and round, these questions will keep hitting us. So we need to take positions and we need to understand those questions fairly good. Then, more important question to me is, do Gandhi and his critiques have two different paradigms? Are they thinking and operating within two different paradigms? And I would say yes, they are in two different paradigms, and I will try to understand these different paradigms, and I will try to see how much and how do we address those questions within Gandhian paradigm. So there is a Purva Paksh of paradigm A, and there is a Uttar Paksh of Gandhian paradigm. I'll try to see how can we engage with these two paradigms. And one idea that I would like to share with you, that instead of really engaging with Gandhi historically, in the sense that with so much of historical data and so much of statements by Gandhi and all, I would like to engage in the domain of political reasoning. So it will basically based on reason. I should be refuted on the basis of reason instead of factual details. So why is it important to engage with Gandhi? I will just quickly sum up this idea. I think humanity is passing through a serious crisis. We are passing through a serious crisis. I will not go into detail, but I will call it the cancerous stage of capitalism. There's a huge trust deficit. There's a dangerous level of inequality. There's an existential crisis of human species due to ecological disaster and possible wars, nuclear wars and all. There's an interesting musical group it has made some videos called A Film on Possibility. I will share the visual of that. I think that group has made very interesting points. I'll just come in a minute. So it looks like there is an urgency to engage with Gandhi. For discovering a new utopia to counter the dystopian world in which we are living. I was just conducting a survey of literature, contemporary popular literature globally, and I'm quite convinced that we are living in a dystopian world. Almost everywhere I discovered the top 10 novels are dystopian. And there are some novels which are dystopian published in 1970s, they are being reprinted and become extremely popular, which means that indicates the mood of the time, and the mood of the time is dystopian, and therefore there's a need to look for new utopia as the old utopias have really collapsed, or at least they are not working well. And in order to discover new utopia, we need to engage in a dialogue with philosophers of liberation, and Gandhi is one of them, definitely. So I think we would like to engage with Gandhi as a philosopher of liberation. The another point why we need to really engage with this critique is that we would like to see what is the intention of the critique. Do they want to demolish Gandhi just as a person or as a paradigm? I think they are interested in demolishing Gandhi not as a person, but more as a paradigm, because the paradigm they are finding it difficult. And the counter paradigm they want to propose, we will talk about that. I think his experiments with truth are extremely important with the emergentist reality that we are engaging with today. And also we must talk about the mode of engagement. I think the mode of engagement with Gandhi has to be a kind of cognitive process, that we want to see the method that Gandhi was using. We want to learn from what Gandhi was experiencing during the movement. This is the film I'm talking about, a film on possibility. There's a musical group, Shikari, which talks about the existential risk of human species and the great unknown. And it lists certain problems that humanity is facing. The paradigm of obsessive self, problem of nuclear conflict, resource inequality, trust deficit, tribalism, which we should read as identity politics, existential risk of humanity, technological trap in which we are caught in, and then it suggests that we must offer an alternative. And we must understand that good and evil are part of us, and we must keep the middle finger away, which means that the way we have been talking about till now in terms of contradictions, we need to talk more in terms of compassion and cooperative and cooperation and all that. Why I'm sharing this, I think this sounds like quite Gandhian. I don't know if the musical group is impressed by Gandhi or has read Gandhi at all, but if you listen to the videos and watch the videos that they have made, it gives you an impression that these people are actually aware of the contemporary issues, and maybe spontaneously or autonomously they are reaching to the conclusion which could be similar to Gandhian conclusion. Now let me come to this point, the central point that I'm making, that do Gandhi and his critiques have two different paradigms? I don't need to introduce the idea of paradigm to this group. Two set of assumptions, two set of frameworks of understanding. I want to take help of a book called Possessive Individualism by C.B. Macpherson. And the argument is, I'm sure the political science students must have read it. Satish, just let me know if I need to speak in Hindi. Satish?
I think you can go ahead as per your convenience. So some of the students, of course, are from Hindi medium, but I think they can understand English.
So whatever suits you, sir.
All right. No, I'm bad in both, so that doesn't matter to me. So methodological individualism suggests that if you want to understand Hobbes and Locke, you will have to read the time, the assumption of the time. And the assumption of the time they discovered was possessive individualism, which I think the assumption of the modern time. And I take this concept in this framework, in this discussion, as a paradigm, as a framework that Gandhi's critiques do have. And this paradigm is quite hegemonic. It's almost in our collective consciousness. We are not even questioning that paradigm today. It is a paradigm of domination. It tries to control us. I will come to that point. Gandhi's project was counter-hegemony and decolonizing mind. Today, a lot of debate is going on about decolonizing mind, which basically argues that decolonization has to be done in terms of terminologies or in terms of language, in terms of conceptual frames. I think decolonization of mind should mean basically getting rid of this philosophical framework that is called possessive individualism. That has become much more dominant with the neoliberal framework, the neoliberal economic assumptions that have become acceptable to us. Gandhi's alternative framework, which I call a paradigm of liberation, is based on his understanding of Indian intellectual traditions and alternative Western traditions. It is not only Indian. I'm not interested in getting into the debate on India, East versus West. I would suggest that there is more humanitarian framework available to Gandhi, both in East and West, and Gandhi adopts that to generate his paradigm of liberation or his own paradigm, which I call ethical realism. And I would suggest that the Gandhi and his critiques are operating in these two different paradigms. His critiques are in the paradigm of domination, which I call possessive individualism, and Gandhi is in paradigm of liberation, which I call ethical realism. Let me just explain these two, Purv Paksh and Uttar Paksh. I think the Uttar Paksh is possessive individualism and paradigm of domination. Purv Paksh, and the Uttar Paksh is ethical realism and paradigm of liberation. What is the idea of self in these two? Very quickly, I will do it so that I can go to 6 questions faster. The idea of self in Purv Paksh is obsessive self, alienated self, body-centric, detotalized self. The total mind-body distinction. The body is the most important thing for them. Whereas in Gandhi's ethical realism, it is creative self, non-alienated self, relational self. We are relational, human beings are relational, and we experience ourselves more in relation, and there's a body-mind unity, and we are the totalized self. How do we look at nature in these two different paradigms? One is very anthropocentric, that we have to master nature. There has to be private ownership of resources. Control the nature, exploit the nature, these are the words they use. Gandhi is very non-anthropocentric vision. Not only human beings, other living beings, even non-living beings must be respected. And human beings have to have harmony with nature. We should think of collective ownership. We should think more of cooperatives than having the private multinational companies. How do they look at society? The integration of self-seeking individuals, producing relations with distrust, the market morality. The other one, ensemble of relationship produced by seva, self-sacrifice, humanitarian morality. How do they look at state? The state is march of God on the earth to resolve the conflict in society produced by self-seeking individuals. It's a state-centric society, a state at the center of the power. The other one, society-centric state, where the state is by small s. the decentralization of power is more important. Power should be from top to bottom and should be decentralized in people's, sorry. Just a minute. I think there is a, yeah. Then what is the politics for them? For Purupaksh, it is game of power, domination, control. I call it P1, power 1. For the other one, it is transformative, achieving higher level of society to create conditions for self-realization of human beings. That is power 2. And what is political action? End justifies the means. Violence countered by violence. Elite action, leadership, there's a gap between leader and masses. The other one, Gandhian frame, means justifies the end, assertion of ethical agency, and that the politics as ethics, the relation between politics and ethics is much more mutual. And what are the sources? Scientific rationality, industrial revolution ethos, thinkers of modernity from Descartes to Marx, and please don't mind if I'm writing Marx there. I not even Descartes, I think all these thinkers do have liberative ideas, and Marx is closer to Gandhi in that sense, but I'm just taking Marx here because I think larger framework is the same, and that is where we need to develop a critique of Marx. For Gandhi, the sources are Indian intellectual traditions, spiritual leaders like Buddha, Mahavir, Jesus, Muhammad, Rumi, Janak. J.P.S. Oberoi has written a very interesting article about AIDS in society where he tries to define the role of sannyasi and fakir in our society. I think that is the imagination that Gandhi has in mind when he thinks of politics and society in India. So this is the framework. And I think these 6 questions, if we look at from 2 different frameworks, we have 2 different visions. And therefore, I would appeal that we must look at this question from Gandhi's ethical realism framework. If you agree with the distinction between these 2 frameworks I have argued, maybe we can have more question on that. I don't have time to really elaborate upon them. I think if you look at the question of Bhagat Singh, that is one of the questions that we confront all the time, that why did Gandhi did not defend Bhagat Singh? And the Purupaksh suggests that Gandhi was telling a lie, that he tried his best. Gandhi was selfish enough, he was ruthless in pursuing his self-interest, and he marginalized Bhagat Singh. He wanted Bhagat Singh to be out from the scene because he was almost losing the game. Bhagat Singh was becoming very, very much popular. I think this paradigm does not understand the meaning of martyrdom. This framework doesn't have this understanding. Gandhi, on the other hand, has this understanding of the martyrdom, and he realizes the importance of Bhagat Singh's sacrifice. Subhash Chandra Bose has written that Gandhi made his best possible efforts to save Bhagat Singh, and there are number of evidences for that. I don't have time to quote them, but anybody can find this part of the public domain where Gandhi and Irwin exchanges suggest that Gandhi was constantly trying to do that. But yes, beyond a point, it was not possible, as both of them were existing in 2 different philosophical frames. Bhagat Singh was also an ethical realist. He was ethics, very strong ethics with his revolutionary violence, and Gandhi was respecting that a lot. Bhagat Singh wrote very clearly that he would like to follow the law, and he has committed a crime against the state according to the law, and he must be punished. And Gandhi respected that. I call it Socratic movement of Bhagat Singh and Gandhi both. I will not go into detail. We can have more details on this. Similarly, there are 2 more events which I've clubbed together, and people say there's a big democratic deficit in Gandhi. One is Bose's election, other is Nehru's selection. We all know the event. I don't need to really mention that how Gandhi made it a prestige issue and he wanted Bose to be out and he supported uh, Sitaramaiah for the presidential candidate. And the Purupaks suggest that this is very undemocratic of Gandhi. He was actually going against all principles of democracy and he was very authoritarian. He was completely wrong on this point. Similarly, on Patel and Nehru, people think that Patel was supported by almost all the PCC members and Nehru was supported by none. Yet Gandhi wrote a small slip to Patel and Patel proposed Nehru's name for President of Congress. And we know that whoever would be President of Congress would become the Prime Minister of India at the time. So, which means that Patel lost the chance of becoming Prime Minister. And there are a number of videos on this suggesting that Gandhi actually ditched Patel and it was humiliating Patel and all that, and Patel lost that chance of becoming a Prime Minister. Again, on this, I think I will not go into the factual details. There are so many things available. One, that Bose and Gandhi were disagreeing on the way Congress should have moved, and the disagreement was very philosophical. And I think Gandhi has political intuition to understand Patel's future moves. Bose's future moves. Gandhi was understanding fairly. I mean, I really admire Gandhi's capacity to discern Bose's mind about the nature of politics in which Bose would have taken Indian movement to. And therefore, Gandhi was very legitimized. Gandhi was very legitimate in taking that kind of action, and that was very, I would call it not a procedural democracy, but substantive democracy. It was defending democracy in a way when he was suggesting, not going against Bose. And remember, after this, Bose called him father of the nation. After this, Bose always praised Gandhi all the time. And Gandhi also kept praising Bose. It was a higher level of difference that we must realize. These were not very simple, contemporary, low base level of politics that they were involved in. Similarly, in case of Patel, I think Gandhi's judgment that Patel would have been a great home minister, but India needed a prime minister which could see this newly emerging nation making its space in the world politics. And Patel did realize himself, probably in many conversations, that Nehru had this strength. He has written, I have quotes to suggest that Patel has several times said that Nehru's understanding was really wonderful on these things. And remember, Nehru was not a small person. He served prison maximum time among the leaders, including Gandhi and Patel. He was in prison for 10 years. Young man, of course, who could have led India for at least a decade. Patel was almost towards the end of his life. So Gandhi's decision of taking Nehru as Prime Minister, I think, has an element of supporting substantive democracy. And the intention of Gandhi was not to make a Prime Minister who would always follow Gandhi's dictate. Remember, Patel was closer to Gandhi that way. Patel hardly disobeyed Gandhi, and Nehru was always challenging Gandhi on all fronts. I think it was very clear towards the end of the national movement that there were differences between Gandhi and Nehru, and the moment Nehru becomes Prime Minister, Gandhi will have some kind of issues with him. It was very clear, and later exchanges also suggest that very clear. Yet Gandhi went for that, which only suggests that Gandhi was not really involved in, it was not a self-seeking individual as the possessive individualism tries to portray Gandhi. Gandhi's understanding of political scenario globally and in India was definitely much better than many of the contemporary leaders. And more than that, Gandhi's agency, which nobody could defy, was amazing. Let me come to another controversial issue, Khilafat movement. Was it the biggest Gandhian folly? A lot of people have now started talking about, particularly this Mapila violence is something that has caught our imagination. We all always read that it was a peasant revolt. Now we are realizing that it was much more than that. A lot of new facts have come, new letters written at that time by many people have come. Ambedkar has said something about it. So Khilafat movement, how do we look at that? I remember talking to Dharmendra, who suggests that we cannot defend Gandhi on that. I don't want to defend Gandhi, I'm sure, but I'm trying to understand what was he doing and how far it was correct within his own paradigm of ethical realism. I think imagine a situation when you have to organize a movement against the mighty colonial power. You cannot do it without bringing major communities together. And at that time, definitely, people in India were thinking in terms of communities. Even today, we all know that the moment the political moment comes, we find that people start thinking in terms of communities. Why do we do that? We don't know. How long shall we do that? We don't know. The impact we can understand. So there was a major challenge before Gandhi. How do you bring these communities together? And Gandhi was a realist. He knew that without understanding the collective consciousness of the other community and engaging with that, it would be impossible to bring the communities together. So he tried to engage with collective consciousness of both the communities. And the dominant aspect of collective consciousness was actually religion. And they were religious communities to a great extent. No matter how much differences within these communities were there, but they were broadly speaking religious communities. So Gandhi was trying to engage with religion. And I would rather argue that Gandhi was a pioneer of liberation theology. And liberation theology, remember, is not an arrived concept, it is an emerging concept. So Gandhi was pioneer and he was experimenting with that. And of course, these experiments had a lot of dangers. So Gandhi engaged with the collective consciousness. He could make some dent there. He could win over some people to his own side who started participating in his movement. That was a real given situation. Today we are reimagining everything. Today we think it was not most ideal thing to do. Of course, it was not most ideal thing to do, but probably it was the most realist thing to do. For a leader who had to mobilize people, these were the options available. And within that, he made very ethical choice. And this choice made the anti-colonial struggle a mass movement, and the biggest, largest mass movement of the world. Of course, there were dangers. And also, I think, where Gandhi failed within his paradigm, one can say that his realism was very limited. One can say that his understanding of reality probably was not materialist enough. One can say that he should have read Marx more seriously. Or I don't know if he had read Marx at all, but he should have read Marx to understand the objective conditions with which he was playing. I think he had too much of self-confidence that he would transform the frozen circumstances on his own tune, which probably did not happen. So that critique I would think would be very legitimate, but as far as his strategy was concerned, I think there was no alternative compared to this, what Gandhi did. Of course, the Mapila revolt, I am yet working on that and trying to look at the documents and other things. Gandhi should have been influential enough to to argue against any kind of violence during a Khilafat movement, which probably Gandhi could not do. I think Gandhi could not understand, as I said, the multiple layers of the movement. He was engaging with the top enlightened leadership, but was not knowing the layers which could produce violence. Of course, Gandhi argued that this violence is against the structural violence, which possibly was there, but even that Gandhi should have been able to control, maybe by physically being present there. But probably at that time, Gandhi did not have enough agency to mobilize people among the Muslims. Not even among Hindus, I guess. Was Gandhi responsible for partisan? This is another question that I see a lot of people have been raising, that Gandhi was responsible for partisan, he did not stop partisan, he did not do enough to stop partisan, all that. And the allegation is that Gandhi probably, it was his individual failure, because this possessive individualism perspective does not have any idea of the structural logic and the real situation. It only tries to see the world in terms of individuals and their actions. So it doesn't really understand the given conditions in which it was happening. Now, it also believes one of the features of this framework is that it can only think in terms of nation state, and nation states also always in contradictions, living in contradictions, as the individuals in contradictions, self-seeking individuals with obsessive self. Similarly, the nation states, the concept of the international relations is that it is a self-seeking nation states, always in conflict with other state, and they have all right to protect their own self-interest. That is the framework within which they are looking at these things, where Gandhi's understanding of these things were different. I think the first point I would like to make is that partisan was a collective failure. It was not Gandhi's failure, it was a collective failure of the movement. I have a list of people, large number of Muslim intellectuals and thinkers and political activists and groups which were against partisan. Even they could not stop partisan. And there was a limit to Gandhi's agency. And that I will come to this point later on, that Gandhi realized that his agency was not so powerful. He was not like Rumi, he was not like Buddha, he was not like so many other great people whose presence itself could have stopped violence. It did at times when it threatened to die. It threatened to commit suicide in a way by going on hunger strike. But it was not so big, and Gandhi realized that, and he then started his new experiments to acquire new agency. I think that I will come later on. So, failing to stop partisan was probably not Gandhi's singular failure or Gandhi's individual failure. I think it was a collective failure. And what is interesting is that once he failed to stop partisan, he started exploring other possibilities. He started thinking, he definitely failed, and he acknowledged the failure, that despite his very conscious efforts, he could not convince the communities that they can live together peacefully, at least all the people. Or that could not become the most dominant way of looking at things. But then Gandhi started exploring other possibilities of two countries living together peacefully, two brothers living together peacefully. He had the desire to go to the other country, to Pakistan, and talk to people and negotiate. He was reimagining the situation by thinking that probably these two nation states could be having very porous border, could be having much more mutual cooperation, could be having much more international relations based on shared culture, shared history, and also shared history of the freedom struggle. I think Gandhi probably did not have enough time or energy to pursue this project. This is one of the unfinished projects of Gandhi, and people did not really understand this project after the uh, after the independence, and therefore it could not be carried on properly either side of the country. I mean, I was just looking at the textbooks of Pakistan, which demonizes Gandhi like anything. That side also probably there now. Younger generation has started raising questions about Gandhi. That how do we has our have our textbooks looked at Gandhi? A lot of videos I was coming across where they are raising these questions about Gandhi, that probably we have been misguided about Gandhi. Gandhi was much more different than it has been projected in Pakistan. So I think that project remained unfinished, and Gandhi was interested in that project. He wanted to live for that project for next few decades at least. Then Gandhi's idea of nation state was also different. I think he was thinking of civilizational society, and about Asian society, he was always thinking probably there's so much of shared population, shared culture, shared values, that there would not be much problem. I think a lot of ideas Gandhi received from different geographical regions in Asian society. Like I always think Gandhi's secular idea of secularism was deeply influenced by Rumi. I don't have time to prove that point, but I can talk about it. Uh, sorry. Sorry. Just a minute. So I think Gandhi's reimagination of this interrelation between nations now becoming very relevant when we are standing at the verge of mutual destruction with nuclear power in hand. Probably Gandhi was imagining this thing, and therefore his ethical realism, this framework is now extremely important to look at the whole thing differently. The last thing, and I hope I have 10 minutes time, Satyaji.
Yeah, you can take 10 to 15 minutes.
Yeah, so this is the last point and the most controversial also, and something on which I have been thinking since long and I am not sure about it. That is Gandhi's experiment with sexuality. Was it to cover up Gandhi's very body-centric understanding of himself, like any other possessive individual whose desires were very dominant, but as he wanted to project himself a great man, therefore he created a kind of a cover to continue that kind of obsessive self. The possessive individualism framework treats Gandhi as individual who was deeply obsessed with his body, and he was a perverse person who, in the name of his experiments with celibacy, exploited women, minor girls, including his own relatives. That is the kind of idea being projected on these YouTube videos. And same idea is being repeated in so many videos. I mean, you can see a flood is there, and social media is flooded with this kind of argument. This framework takes sexuality as a sin. I think very interestingly, Sudhir Kakkar has argued in his book Intimate Relations. There's a whole entire chapter on Gandhi and women. I don't have time to talk about it in detail, but it's worth reading text where he suggests that the discussion on Gandhi's sexuality in the public domain also has to do with repressed sexuality in India in general. And Gandhi was understanding that. So this possessive individualism framework actually works with the repressed sexuality. It's like counting condoms in JNU. I mean, I don't want to say much about it, but you can understand this kind of psychology. Counter to this, what is the ethical realist framework of understanding sexuality? I think Gandhi has an entire framework, and which is very interesting, and we must explore it further. He borrowed the understanding of human nature from Indian intellectual tradition and redefined. The understanding is based on the idea of Purusharth and Vikar. Arth, Kam, Dharma, Moksha, and Vikar is Kam, Krodh, Lobh, Madh, Moh, Irsya. Gandhi redefined them. Like Earth is human beings' relation with nature. He conducted experiments with that. He talked about food. He talked about how much should we draw, how much should we take from nature. He talked about the property regime. He talked about trusteeship. He talked about so many things. He redefined humans' relation with nature, tried to redefine that. Similarly, he engaged with dharma, the duty, religion, social laws, all those things. Challenged the dominant paradigms within Hinduism, of course. Several practices he challenged. He engaged with texts, reinterpreted texts, made them more ethically oriented, and also experimented with each one of them. Like moksha, he redefined moksha not as the otherworldly desire, but moksha means being conscious of consciousness and being control on one's control on oneself. Krodh and Irsya and all those things I don't need to talk to. The most difficult part of the whole thing was Kam. And Kam is not equivalent to sexuality. I think Kam is much more complex. And there's an entire Kam Sutra that one can see how it understands Kama. So the Indian tradition has very rich in talking about Kama. And it talks about Kama very openly. The idea that Kama is sexuality is a sin, if we translate Kama as sexuality, was not part of Indian reality. I think there are evidences to suggest, and I don't need to argue about it, I think it's so obvious that it was never a sin in India. Even homosexuality has been declared as crime only in the colonial period, and it continued in the post-colonial period. There are evidences to suggest that homosexuality was discussed in earlier texts, and it was never considered as crime. It was considered as unnatural or deviant behavior, but never as crime. So I think sexuality is one of the biggest problems of today, also for the modernity. Because modernity always thought that sexuality is a thing of the body, not of the mind. You remember the books which were banned in mid-19th century. Lady Chatterley's Lover, Fanny Hill. So many books you will find. Most of the books are banned on the ground of explicit sexual discussions. But if you go deeper into debate, you will discover that those books were actually asserting a point that the dominant paradigm of mind-body relationship, that was Cartesian dualism, was a problem. It was not acceptable. Something that now people like Zizek are saying, that all anti-Cartesians should come together. That Zizek is saying that end of time has come, that the Cartesian dualism has done enough damage to the world. So I think this idea of Kama being site where you really experience the mind-body relationship, that has been part of our intellectual tradition from long back. You read Sudhir Kakkar's Ecstasy, a novel on Ramakrishna Paramahansa and his experiments with his body. It is a psychoanalytic understanding of his experiments. I don't have time to go into detail, but it's a wonderful way of understanding the relationship in Indian tradition. I think Gandhi acknowledged that. Gandhi acknowledged the complexity of Kam, which was part of Purusharth and part of Vikar simultaneously. Just imagine. Kam is part of Purusharth and part of Vikar. So what is Vikar and what is Purusharth? Where do we stop that? How do we differentiate between the two? These were the things that Gandhi was interested in. Gandhi was exploring those things. Now, exploring or experimenting with sexuality is not new. Again, I would refer to Sudhir Kakkar's interesting novel called Kam Yogi. It is a novel on Purusha, on uh, uh, author of Vatsayan. It's novel on Vatsayan, author of Kam Sutra. And the novel suggests that every time he was experimenting with it and trying to understand the complexity of that. So this experiment with Arth, Kam, Dharma, Moksha and Vikar, these are part of Indian intellectual tradition, and Gandhi probably was trying to find out certain kind of newness in that. Because Gandhi was acknowledging the relationship between spirituality and sexuality. I think he was one of those who understood that spirituality is as natural to us as sexuality. And there is a deep relation between the two. Again, if you look at ecstasy, in that Sudhir Kakkar talks about tantric understanding of sexuality and spirituality relationship. So Gandhi could understand it. But what's most amazing thing that I found in Gandhi was that he was connecting this sexuality with politics. And as I mentioned earlier, when he failed in controlling violence, he thought that his failure has to do with lack of his control on himself. And therefore, he could not reach to the level of the Jain monk, Mahavira or Buddha or Jesus, whose presence itself could have solved the problem. And it is that time when Gandhi is experimenting with sexuality. It is that time when Gandhi thought, and it was I think he was 77 by that time. So you will find in these videos or some of the articles very explicit discussion about what Gandhi was doing and its interpretation and projection in a way that I think satisfied the depressed sexual mentality available in our society. But if you look at those experiments conducted by a human being of Gandhi's caliber, I think Gandhi was almost like a scientist trying to explore what is sexuality and how it was related with violence. You know, I was always wondering that why in today's world rape culture has emerged, and that too when you see news, most of the time you will find it is gang rape. I discovered in one of the serials where the lady during intercourse tells the man who is a goon that you are thinking that your frustration outside will be over by producing violence on my body during sexuality. You are wrong. I think Gandhi could understand this relationship between sexuality and politics, sexuality and violence. These experiments have to be taken as his ethical realist experiments with sexuality. I'm not sure if I'm sounding convincing about it, but I'm pretty convinced that within this framework, if you start looking at Gandhi, not as if you are looking at a person of 77-year-old having a physical relation with a girl, or if they are together, it's only about the physical relationship. I think one has to transcend that framework of thinking about these experiments. Probably that might help us in understanding and finding more deeper things in these experiments. And remember, Gandhi never tried to hide that. I mean, I'm fully convinced about Gandhi's intention, that Gandhi has signed on the documents produced by this girl who was involved in the experiment. So he was knowing everything. And none of them have actually charged Gandhi I think they were fully aware that they were in the experiment. Uh, I also think that Gandhi never tried to hide that, and he wrote about it, and writing about it makes this experiment much more respectable. It is only now when some people want to demolish Gandhi as an idea. It is very easy to demolish on that ground. I always say that in India, maybe even in the world, there are two grounds on which you can demolish a person. One is financial corruption, or the other is sexual corruption. And you don't even think about it twice. We are using this framework to understand Gandhi, which I think would be a mistake. I think we need to evolve a new framework of ethical realism to comprehend what Gandhi was doing. And probably that will be much more beneficial for humanity at the moment. I can refer back to one of the serials that is very, the book which actually conditioned the thinking about sexuality in US. The doctor who is conducting several research on sexuality, and it is it is on Netflix now. The serial is on Netflix now. So the world has started doing it now, exploring it now in much more rigorous way. Yet I think it is very complicated. It is very difficult, partly because our framework of mind-body relationship has been problematic, which Gandhi tries to
Maninji,
ha.
another 2 3 minutes so that we can have some time.
1 minute, only 1 minute. I think I'm concluding.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think Gandhi's Uttar Paksh seems to be more complex and more convincing compared to the Purv Paksh critique of Gandhi. We need to have this paradigm shift to engage with Gandhi, to take out something from Gandhi which can help us in creating new utopia. The precondition for engaging with Gandhi, I think, is a cognitive reading of Gandhi and his life and his work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jha, and thank you, Maninder, for delightful talk and really, provocative. I would say, but also. I mean, these are troubling questions. These 6 questions have troubled the Indian consciousness for a long time, and I am so pleased that you have you've actually taken them by their throat and tried to deal with them. I'm grateful that you put it so clearly that there are 2 completely different paradigms of thought, and that the dominant paradigm swallows us up so much that we are unable to think otherwise. I think that is a very useful way of looking at what Gandhi was trying to do. Now, without taking too much time, I have I have a few questions, and also this Bose's election. I'm grateful to you for having put it that way, because I used to always wonder why Gandhi. I could not completely understand Gandhi's intervention there, but you're saying that he was actually defending democracy is a good way to turn the question around. My only worry there is that, when it came to partition, Gandhiji says something, if I remember right, that he could not go against public opinion. So I have always wondered why that the dominant public opinion was that partition should happen and so on and so forth. But I've always wondered why he did not vote there in favor of democracy and Hindu-Muslim unity and subvert this group. And I don't feel that your objection or your explanation that he could not, there were too many people involved who wanted partition. Uh, I would expect that Gandhi would have had more in him to subvert the decision, just as he did in the case of Bose's election. So that is one. I agree with the direction of your argument, but this is something that has. I feel that Gandhiji explanation that it was public opinion that stopped him from actually pushing much harder against partition. I don't feel satisfied with Gandhiji's argument there. And just one more comment, if I may. When you talk about this question of Gandhiji's experiments with sexuality or celibacy, one would say. This question that you raised, that this rape culture and this lady's testimony, that in a sense, actually, that testimony, I feel, I would like your response to that. I feel it's actually reflecting Gandhiji's principle or his cosmology, when he says, as in the individual, so in the universe. So I think if you look at microcosm, the rape as a microcosm, which is reflecting what is happening in the universe, then actually you can only transform. So the transformational potency or potential for transformation is both ways, that you change the universe and you change human relations. And so when we deal with rape the way we do, with capital punishment and with treating the rapist not as also himself a victim in some ways of his circumstance, that there is a pathology to rape and to the rapist's mind. I feel that we have not taken that aspect seriously enough in dealing with rape in recent years. So this thing about the cosmology, and that was what Gandhi was trying to work out during the partition, that if he had these the microcosmic sexual experiments where his violence was completely controlled, then it would reflect in the universe around him. The non-violence would reflect. So in a sense, this lady's testimony supports that cosmological view. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for this completely exciting talk, and I will hand over now to Aryaman, is it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Anuradha. Argument, in fact, meanwhile, you can start reading the question from the chat book. Dr. Thakur, would you like to respond to Anuradha now, or would you like to take up some?
I can respond
Okay.
in short. I think on the first question, I'm not sure. How do we look at Gandhi's failure in stopping? Whether we take his statements very seriously, or we do need to analyze his limitation. At times, his statements do not reflect the complete situation. I have two feelings about it. One, that Gandhi, over the time, lost his contact with masses. As when the state was emerging, got so much involved in the political process, and large number of people who did not want partition, Gandhi could have gave leadership to them to go against the force which was for the partition. I think that is something that Gandhi could not capture probably, or he didn't have time, energy, or whatever to go back to them. That's a puzzle for me. I mean, he could have easily mobilized huge number of Muslims even to go against Muslim League. Given a choice, he would have gone for that. Why did he do that? Why he thought that public opinion is for partisan? I'm not sure. I think even at that time, if you go by public opinion in numerical terms, you would find that probably larger number of people were not in favor of partisan. In fact, many people have now are now arguing that partisan was done without referendum. Gandhi would have argued for referendum and it would have given him more time to engage with people and mobilize people in his favor. Probably that is where Gandhi's failure might lie. Within the framework of politics that time, he was caught and he did not assert the agency that he had, or probably he undermined his own agency at that time. I think we need more research to get into the circumstances. Second thing is the sexuality. I'm thankful to you for raising this question. I think that is the point that Gandhi is making, and therefore he's experimenting with sexuality in Noakhali when he's challenging he's facing the challenge of violence. He thinks that's a cosmological understanding that if there is a kind of peace within, it will be reflected in the universe. And there is a problem that we have not resolved that problem within us so well, and therefore the violence is there. A lot of people don't understand this argument that Gandhi is giving, that why is he connecting the communal violence with his own failure in terms of controlling his sexuality, or in terms of arriving to the level of Mahavir Jain. I think he thought that if I can become Mahavir Jain, my presence itself should have stopped violence. This is the cosmology where human agency has huge power. I think Gandhi's imagination of cosmology was that. This is a very interesting way of looking at this, and I think what you said rightly, that the way we are treating the rape cases now, the way we demanded for death punishment for rape cases, it only reflects that we don't understand this cosmology where human beings have this kind of problems. Maybe we need to change the paradigm of thinking about death, rape, punishment, crime, and all those things. That is what Gandhi was always arguing, I guess.
Just a moment. What I found really interesting was that lady understood.
Yes.
What was happening.
Yes.
So her response is in terms of this frustration with the world versus violence to the female body. So this so it's an inverse form of the cosmology of the brahmacharya experiments.
Yes.
But it's actually following the same principle. So somewhere along the line, it is the buddhijivis or the intellectuals who are not in sync with this point of view. So it is an intellectual failure.
Yes.
Yes.
I would agree with you entirely. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Arjunan, in fact, Renu Thakur has been raising her hand.
Yeah, sure, sir. Renu Thakur, you can go ahead and
Vikram Singhal also.
mute yourself, and then you can ask the question, followed by Vikram Singhal.
Very good evening, sir.
Yeah,
Sir, I have a very simple question, which is normal and I listen from everyone. मजबूरी का नाम महात्मा गांधी, ऐसा क्यों कहते हैं? और मुझे इसके प्रोटेस्ट में जवाब देना है गांधी जी के समर्थन में, तो मैं क्या कहूँ? अक्सर जब भी गांधी जयंती पे ही सुनने को मिलता है, which is I don't like. बस इसका आंसर।
इसका
ठीक है,
बहुत
धन्यवाद।
इसका बहुत सीधा सा जवाब है, मजबूती का नाम महात्मा गांधी। मजबूरी की जगह मजबूती का नाम महात्मा गांधी, क्योंकि आप देखो ना कि कभी वो मजबूर नहीं फील करते थे अपने आप को, लगातार वो मजबूत होकर खड़े रहते थे। इमेजिन करो कि पूरा दंगा हो रहा है, लोग मारे जा रहे हैं, और वो बीच में जाके खड़ा हो जाता है। वो कितना मजबूत आदमी होगा जो कि दंगे के बीच में पैदल चल रहा है और उसको देख के लोग रुक जा रहे हैं। यदि आपने गांधी फिल्म देखी होगी तो सारे लोग गांधी पे अटैक करने के लिए आए हुए हैं, और पटेल उनसे कह रहा है बाहर नहीं निकले, और गांधी कहता है बिल्कुल नहीं, मैं बाहर निकलूंगा, और बाहर निकलते हैं और सबके हाथ से सामान छूट जाता है। आई थिंक ही वॉज वेरी स्ट्रांग, नॉट वीक एट ऑल, बोथ लिटरल सेंस, फिजिकली ऑल्सो। ही ऑलवेज थॉट कि वो 125 साल तक जिंदा रहेंगे। उनको कोई बीमारी नहीं थी गांधी जी को उनके बॉडी में। तो ये मजबूती का नाम महात्मा गांधी। मजबूरी में तो बिल्कुल ही महात्मा गांधी आप नहीं हो सकते हैं। मजबूर लोग ही वायलेंट होते हैं। वायलेंस एक्चुअली हम तब करते हैं, आप देखो ना, जब अपने बच्चे को हम पीटते हैं तो कब पीटते हैं? जब हम इतने मजबूर हो जाते हैं कि अपने ऊपर कोई कंट्रोल नहीं रहता, हमारा अपने गुस्से के ऊपर कंट्रोल नहीं रहता है, तो हम मजबूर हो जाते हैं पीटने के लिए। लेकिन जो मजबूत लोग हैं वो आखिर दम तक अपने आप को मैनेज करते हैं, आपको चैनलाइज करते हैं गुस्से को क्रिएटिवली। सो गांधी वॉज दैट काइंड ऑफ मजबूत पर्सन। सो आपको हमेशा कहना चाहिए मजबूती का नाम महात्मा गांधी।
थैंक यू सर।
Good afternoon, sir. I have a very simple question that when we are talking about the paradigms of possessive individualism and ethical realism, the Gandhian idea of truth, authentic truth, and ethical realism, Gandhian idea of truth along with the Advaitin idea of Sat and ethical realism. Can we say that ethical realism is a kind of a manifestation, a physical manifestation when we extrapolate this idea of truth? That's it, sir. That's my question.
Thank you, Vikram. I think, and thanks to you for your comments before the conference. And I shared my PowerPoint with him, and he really gave wonderful insights. I think, Vikram, actually, ethical realism is very much linked with the idea of truth that Gandhi has. And I would put it like ethical is real and real is ethical. For Gandhi, the ethics is not something unreal. It is not something outside the reality. It is as real as anything else. And that is the truth. So his idea of truth, I think, very deeply linked with his ethical realism. And therefore, he always says that my understanding of truth might shift with more knowledge. And ultimate truth, I will have to arrive gradually. So he uses this idea of the Jain idea of Anekantvad. And that the ethics also he derives from, a lot of ethics he derives from Anekantvad. I think that is where one can link his idea of truth and his idea of real.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Sumit, you can go on next.
Sir, why Gandhi wanted to create a stateless society?
Why he wanted a stateless society? Yeah, I think that's a good question. You know, Gandhi always thought that the modern state, what is the modern state? The idea of the modern state is very deeply linked with violence. If you have read Hobbes and Locke, I'm sure you have in your course, how does the modern state emerge? In order to take care of the chaos that is there due to a state of nature in which human beings, selfish human beings, are engaged in violence against each other. So we give our power to the state. So the power to dominate, power to harm other people, all this power is accumulated in the idea of the modern state. Now, that kind of modern state can never bring a peaceful society, because it's based on the idea of violence, and therefore he is against this idea of the state. State should be minimal. State should be managerial state. When, like Marx, when he says that withering away of the state, I think both of them have this common understanding that this concentration of power in one place, that is state, will always create a problem in society. Power one, that is power to dominate, is concentrated there. So decentralize the power. Decentralize the power so much that there is no one central state to do everything. Otherwise, you have now what I call techno-authoritarian state. So much of technology in the hand of state, and once it has decided to be authoritarian, it's almost almighty. Look at the Chinese state, look at the American state, look at the Indian state, how it is now going to undermine your autonomy, any individual's autonomy. We are losing autonomy, agency every day, and we don't know how to reclaim that. So therefore he was very suspicious of the state.
Thank you, sir. Any more questions? You can unmute yourself and go ahead. Any faculty member who has any questions?
Yeah, in fact, Arjun, I would like to come here.
Sure, sir.
Just a brief query. In fact, the last point, 6.1, sexuality, in your entire presentation, particularly the way you have looked at it from the point of view of emancipation discourse in Gandhi, would you like to, see also Rajneesh as a continuation of that emancipation discourse in recent times, the Gandhian discourse on sexuality? Because perhaps he was also looking at it from the point of view of emancipation and freedom. So, in fact, do you find any relationship between the two discourses? The one which was in Gandhi and another which Rajneesh was trying to do?
I think there was a common ground for them, but then there were a lot of differences also. The common ground was both of them probably drawing upon the Indian intellectual tradition of discourse on sexuality. And major discourse on sexuality in Indian intellectual tradition is in tantric philosophy, where liberation is through the body. So sexuality is a means to arrive on the higher consciousness. That is his book called Sambhog Se Samadhi Tak. That it is a means. And if you look at Kakkar's novel, there is an experiment that Ramakrishna Paramahans conducts with the tantrics. So tantric philosophy has, in the West now, tantric philosophy has become very popular because there is a serious problem of sexuality in the West. I was talking to a French friend, and if you look at this book by novels by French writer Michel Houellebecq, you will discover that there's a big problem of sexuality there. And this friend of mine suggests that the West is suffering from this crisis in a deep way, their understanding of sexuality. And therefore, they are going to tantric philosophy, and they are trying to have a lot of websites on tantric philosophy there. So Rajneesh and Gandhi both, I think, are accessing the Indian intellectual tradition of sexual discourse on sexuality. The difference between the two is, and that is Gandhi's innovation, I guess, that he is linking sexuality also with politics and violence, which Rajneesh does not do. For Rajneesh, it is the individual's complete freedom, getting liberated from for Rajneesh, it is means to achieve your higher level of consciousness. For Gandhi, it is means to achieve your better relational being, better human being, better social relations, and your intervention in politics. I think Gandhi is quite creative there. Apart from layer of consciousness that he says that his brahmacharya is means to that, but more than that, I think Rajneesh is exploring individual sexuality, and Gandhi is exploring social sexuality. And there is a difference, I think, here.
I hope Satish so
In
that.
fact, I can see Dr. Pamela Anwar, Dr. Rajendra Dayal, Rajesh Trivedi, and my friend Dinesh Singh. They may have some observation to make. Some comment. Pamela? Dr. Dayal?
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Observation, yes, sir. Interesting. Very succinctly put questions that Maninder has raised, and these are surely questions that we come across on a daily basis. I'm not very clear about certain issues, but pertaining to the two paradigms, possessive individualism and ethical realism. And I would like to situate all these and try to somewhat reduce it in terms of the Varnashram, the Hindu concept of Varnashram, from Brahmacharya to Grihast, then Banprasth. So, possessive individualism, it is just trying to learn, can that be collapsed into the stage of Grihast ashram? And if the progression from Grihast ashram is towards Banprasth, then that's the stage where there is also a sublimation of sexuality. So, if we try to analyze Gandhi's own thinking and practices within that Hindu tradition, or is he drawing on Jainism and the concept of parigraha? If that is what is orienting him and that's the value matrix for him, then only in that particular case, possessive individualism as a vantage point to criticize Gandhi will have more relevance. But these are all off the cuff thinking, not given thought to it. But to me, it occurs that many of the answers can be found from within this dharmic, this four stages of life philosophy.
Yes. Dharmendra ji, if I can say Professor Dharmendra Kumar also in the program. Yes, Professor Dharmendra Kumar. Dharmendra ji, do you have any comment or observation to make or any question?
I have one question, Satish bhai.
Yes, please go ahead, Dinesh.
Gandhi, in fact, not related, maybe related to Manin bhai's lecture. Gandhi attempted to bring radical social transformation by cooperation, not disturbing the social structure which was prevailing in Indian society. Of course, he said that caste is discriminatory. But there is always a duality in Gandhian position. And do you think that Gandhian duality was exploited by right forces in Indian society? And at the present juncture, that is the rise of rightist forces. How will no? He was talking about social change, but without disturbing. How radical transformation can be brought in Indian society, especially in uh, social aspect.
Yes, Doctor Dwivedi.
Uh,
Yes, please.
uh, uh, the speech delivered by Mr. Thakur was really very good. And that Thakur Sahab very nicely explained the whole situation. My one is observation or question may be there that instead of accepting whatever Gandhi said blindly and without any question, it's good. People are questioning and interrogating. It's a better result of Gandhi. And we should along that question we ask. In a way, it will lead to a better understanding. Otherwise, many conceptions fail. So don't you think, Professor Thakur, that the way the questions are being put, it will ultimately lead to a better understanding of the totality of the Gandhian vision? Yes, sir.
Anyone else? Arjun, do you have any other question in the chat box?
Sir, no question in the chat box. I have a question once. Sir,
Pramila.
then maybe.
Dr. Pramila. Yes. I think now we can request the speaker to respond.
Okay, I think. Okay.
Yes, sir.
I think, Professor Dayal, I would like to think about it. It's an interesting question that whether we can connect the 4 stages of life philosophy with Gandhian framework of ethical realism. I think that at the moment I would think that it is not connected at the moment, but I may change my understanding once I explore it further. But he is developing a framework which is not to be adopted by people only at one stage of life, but at every stage of life. Not that brahmacharya has to be taken up at every stage of life. There is definitely different code of conduct for different stages. But at the same time, the judgmental rationality that he's suggesting, how do you differentiate between right and wrong? What is your connection with nature? How do you look at yourself? How do you look at other living beings and other beings? How do you look at society? All this philosophical frame that ethical realism has this frame is very general, and this frame was challenging the frame that the British the colonialism, the modernity that British colonialism brought to India. Therefore, his counter-hegemonic project was not only limited to people of certain age. And he was drawing upon multiple sources in Indian intellectual tradition. I think he would never suggest to the greyest that you should not have some resources deposited for your future. I think he would suggest this more for political actors. So maybe we can see how Gandhi was talking to many people simultaneously, and yet he had a general framework for everybody, but very specific framework for different kinds of people. So I would like to really go into this more detail. Good that you have said. Thank you for this. I will now explore it further. Dinesh bhai, I think there are 2 questions you are asking. One question is that how without changing the structures you will change society. I don't think Gandhi was not thinking of changing the structure. I think Gandhi, towards the end of his life, after 1935, if you look at Gandhi's writings, these writings are much more critical to capitalism. And he is constantly thinking how to transform these basic structures. But yes, he had tremendous faith in human agency. And he thought that by transforming human agency, you can transform society. So this dialectics of structure and agency, in that I guess you are right, he prioritized agency over structure. But I think that towards the end of his life, he was understanding the limits of agency and exploring the possibilities of agency further. The second question is that was Gandhi's strategy, the duality that Gandhi had, should we hold that responsible for communal politics of today? I think that will be a great misnomer. That would be grossly wrong if we hold Gandhi for the communal politics today. In fact, I would think very differently. I would think that for 70 years or for so many decades, if India did not lapse into communal politics, that was due to Gandhian framework. I would like to think in this way. And the moment, and therefore, those who are believing in communal politics, for them Gandhi has become a great enemy. They really fear Gandhi. They want to replace Gandhi, but they are not able to replace Gandhi. They would like to kill Gandhi. They would like to remove Gandhi from everywhere, but it is not possible. It's even the slightest vision of Gandhi in a person mobilizes Indian people like anything. You have seen the Anna Hazare movement. After all, the movement was basically dependent on Anna Hazare, and Anna Hazare is no match to Gandhi. Just that people thought he's an old Gandhian, and people started trusting him. So I think this trust in Gandhi, huge trust in Gandhi, was responsible for maintaining Indian democracy for a long time. And even today, if you cannot challenge Indian democracy so easily, no party, no politics can challenge Indian democracy so easily. I think it is due to presence of Gandhi in the collective consciousness of Indian society. Professor Dwivedi, I think, yes, questioning Gandhi is very important, not that we should not question Gandhi. My only problem is that polemics against Gandhi is dangerous. And when you are spreading rumor about Gandhi, when you are misinterpreting facts or creating a paradigm that should damage Gandhi, demolish Gandhi, that would be a problem. I'm always there to question Gandhi. I think questioning everybody is very important, including Gandhi. Gandhi was a human being, not a god. He must have committed n number of wrongs, and we must know what wrongs he has committed. But if we engage with Gandhi, if we start digging Gandhi to demolish Gandhi, that would be creating a vitanda. I think we should engage Gandhi for cognitive purpose. And we should move on. I don't think that Gandhi will be able to solve the problem that we are facing today. But Gandhi has a lot of resources which can help in creating a kind of utopia that can be the vision of the future. I would like to see Gandhi like that. So my problem is that through wrong questions, Gandhi is being demolished. And therefore I am a little disturbed.
I hope everyone's questions were answered. Thank you, sir, for answering them. Astha, now I would like to call upon Astha to give the vote of thanks for this occasion.
Thank you, Aryaman. It is my honor and privilege to give a vote of thanks on behalf of the entire Gandhi Study Circle and NSS unit to our chief guest, Dr. Nanendra N. Thakur. Sir has graced the occasion not only by his presence but also by his enlightening words. Today, we had an opportunity to hear Sir's thoughts, and some of them were highly remarkable. Something that struck me was how, so by differentiating between ethical realism and individual and possessive individualism, was able to efficiently clarify and respond to the 6 questions imposed on Mahatma Gandhi's political actions by his critics. I am sure it has shown us all a better direction of thought. Furthermore, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for Professor M.P. Singh for chairing the session and Principal Dr. Manoj Sinha, Convener Gandhi Study Circle Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, and NSS Program Officer Dr. Chandrasekhar Nishad for the perfect logistic support and guidance